Major funding for Benjamin Franklin is provided by
the Northwestern Mutual Foundation. The people of Northwestern Mutual are proud to have supported this remarkable series on PBS, celebrating the wisdom and ingenuity of one of America's most distinguished founding fathers.
Major funding is also provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities, expanding America's understanding of who we were, who we are, and who we will be. The Pew Charitable Trusts, investing in ideas, returning results. Additional funding is provided by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation for Public Understanding of Science and Technology, the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. By these funders, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you, thank you.
I'd already shown that an electrical stroke could melt small quantities of metal. Previously, we had struck a pigeon dead using only electricity. The experiment today was to see whether electricity could kill an animal as large as a turkey. We knew the shock would have to be very great. Everyone in the room was excited, talking to me and to each other, and stupidly, I forgot I was holding the conductor connected to the negative pole of the battery.
Mr. Franklin.
I'm a trifle ashamed of this blunder. A bigger charge, and I might not be talking to you now. It certainly would have been the easiest of all deaths.
Franklin is a wonderful example of a very powerful mind with a very powerful curiosity, immense gifts, and considerable flaws in action.
He presented to the world a face of folksy charm, but beneath this surface lay the fire of enormous ambition. The range of Benjamin Franklin's achievements is astonishing. The inventor who saved the world from the terrors of lightning and the diplomat who rescued the American Revolution is also the author of one of the most widely reprinted books since the Bible.
Franklin would relish the communication and digital revolution we're going through today. And I'm sure he would have been one of the first people in America to have created a website and then also probably created an online service so he could make money off of the website, because he loved the idea of spreading information, thoughts, discourse.
He is the touchstone for every single pivotal point in early American history. His signature on the Declaration of Independence, the Treaty with France, Constitution, is symbolic of Franklin's impact on American history. He signed the documents, but he was the documents.
He basically was a down-to-earth, pragmatic person, somebody who not always practiced what he preached, but always had the detachment and sense of irony to know his true soul. And understanding Franklin's soul is sort of understanding the soul of America.
It is the inclination of old men to talk about themselves and their deeds. But just because I'm old, don't feel you owe me any respect. You can listen or not, as you please. I confess right off, because if I deny it, you won't believe me, that another reason I'm talking about myself is to gratify my own vanity. By the way, have you ever noticed when someone is making a speech which they introduce with the words, "Without vanity, I may say," they always say something very vain about themselves right afterwards? Some people think vanity is an evil. I don't. I think vanity is one of the great comforts of life. I've had a very happy life, so much so that I'd have no objection to living it all over again. Well, perhaps I'd correct a few errors I made the first time round. But since repetition isn't possible, the next best thing is to remember that life and to relate it to you.
Benjamin Franklin was born in Boston, Massachusetts in 1706. Only 15 years earlier, all New England had been consumed by the Salem witch trials.
This is a world where witches are real, and they are doing the work of the devil. Man has very little ability to control cosmic forces, or even understand how the natural world works.
If lightning did damage, it would be conceived of as an affliction that one had earned.
If the Almighty God should from heaven rain down upon Boston a horrible tempest of thunderbolts, it would be no more than our unrepented sins deserve.
Mankind is at the mercy of an all-powerful God. People have little control over their fate and must passively accept their lot. When lightning hits a house, causing it to catch fire, the fire brigade extinguishes the fire only in the adjoining houses, but lets that house burn to the ground. They see it as the will of God. Devils, unseen forces, and God's vengeance. This is the world into which Benjamin Franklin is born.
My father, Josiah Franklin, married young and came with his wife to Boston in 1682 to escape religious persecution in England. Here he had 4 more children by his first wife, and after she died, 10 more by a second wife, my mother, Abiah Folger. In all, Josiah had 17 children. I am the youngest son, born in Boston in 1706.
Franklin will later make much of his rise to prominence from humble beginnings. His father is a tradesman, a candle and soap maker. This is not a world of privilege, far from it. Josiah is a proud, devoutly religious man. He instills in his son the Puritan idea that you have no real control over your destiny. From birth, some have been chosen to go to heaven, and some will burn in the eternal damnation of hell.
As a matter of fact, Clint Eastwood in The Unforgiven gives the essence of Calvinist Puritanism in one sentence. When he kills a man who says that he doesn't deserve to die, and he says deserving has nothing to do with it. That's Calvinism in a nutshell.
Josiah decides to send the young Franklin to school to be educated as a minister.
He was raised in a religious family. His uncle gave him a gift of a multi-volume set of sermons, as he said, presuming that young Ben might set up stock as a preacher.
In Boston, being educated as a minister means that he is being prepared to be a leader in society. The most powerful and influential clergyman in New England is Cotton Mather. Young Franklin is fascinated by his sermons, which take the most commonplace events of daily life and draw out their moral lessons.
I was emptying the cistern of nature, making water on a wall, when a dog came up beside me and did the same thing. I thought to myself, how mean and vile is our mortal state, our natural necessities placing us on the same level as dogs? From that moment on, I resolved that every time I answered the call of nature, I would evoke some divine thought that would rise up and soar to the angels.
Virtually every aspect of Puritanism was accentuated in Cotton Mather. His Puritanism was to the 10th power. Among his reminders to himself is not to enter or leave a room without doing some good in it.
This, for Mather, is one of the central tenets of Puritanism. You glorify God by doing good for your fellow man.
Franklin was early on thrilled with the possibility that he would become his generation's Cotton Mather.
In his old age, Franklin will vividly remember a visit to Cotton Mather and a moral lesson learned.
He was showing me out of the house, and there was a very low beam near the doorway. I was still talking when he began shouting, "Stoop! Stoop!" I didn't understand what he meant and banged my head on the beam. "You're young," he said, "and have the world before you. Stoop as you go through it, and you'll avoid many hard thumps." That advice has been very useful to me. I've avoided many misfortunes by not carrying my head too high in pride.
Franklin, from the get-go, understood that he was a modest man's son, but he had powers that rich men's sons didn't have. He was smarter than they were, he was more adroit than they were, he was stronger than they were.
In school, Franklin soars to the head of his class. He is promoted and immediately rises up in his next class as well. He is beginning to suffer from the Puritan sin of vanity.
Benjamin's getting snide, he's getting uppity, he's getting impatient with stupid people.
At 10 years old, I was taken out of school to assist my father in his business, making soap and candles, cutting wicks, filling the dipping molds, attending the shop, running errands. I hated that trade and had a hankering for the sea. But my father wouldn't allow it. However, living near the water, I was much in it and about it. I taught myself to swim.
It's easy to get caught up with Franklin on the $100 bill, Franklin in the Duplessis portrait, Franklin in Peale's portraits. He is always the elder statesman. It's easy to forget that he had hair once, that he was a little kid, passionately fond of swimming.
He became an excellent swimmer. He was tall and broad-shouldered and athletic-looking and active.
Few people knew how to swim in the 18th century. As a youth, Franklin has to learn by reading a book by the French author Thévenot.
He looked at the drawings that Thévenot had made of, I think, 40 different positions in swimming, and he practiced them all, one by one by one. He mastered them, and as he adds in the autobiography, he added a few of his own.
I was flying a paper kite while swimming in a pond. I found that floating on my back and holding the string, I was pulled across the pond without the least fatigue and with the greatest pleasure imaginable.
He's in a most difficult position. He's brighter even than he knows. And his intelligence has to find an outlet that it cannot find.
Although he's been denied further schooling, Benjamin is sure of one thing. He's not going to spend the rest of his life as a candle maker. He resists so strongly that Josiah finally decides to apprentice young Franklin to his older brother James, a printer.
He persuaded me to sign the indentures and serve as an apprentice until I was 21. I was only 12 years old at the time.
He continues rebelling once he's been made a printer. He still thinks of himself as the kid who was on his way to the college. So, when everyone in James Franklin's printing shop gets together for lunch, Benjamin excuses himself. And after eating a quick meal, he studies in private.
In the print shop, he has access to a rich assortment of books, very different from Cotton Mather's religious tracts.
When he discovered these books, he just ate them up. They're not talking about religious consciousness. They're not talking about who's saved and who's not saved. Gave him a glimpse of something other than the world he was living in.
He begins a methodical program of self-education, learning everything from geometry to the art of winning arguments using the Socratic method.
When he decides he's got to perfect his own writing style, he disassembles the books in front of himself, word by word, and then rewrites them.
It was an extraordinary intensity of effort that just is awesome.
He would make little notes on pieces of paper, the theme of a paragraph or the various points in the thing. He would put it aside for a while, come back, and then try to compose it. In a few cases, he thought he even made a slight improvement over these masters of English writing.
His brother James publishes one of the first newspapers in America, the New England Courant. Much of the content of this paper appears in the form of fictitious letters to the editor, adopting different personae, but actually written by James Franklin and his friends.
He also begins to receive a number of papers signed Silence Dogood, an obvious pseudonym.
The letters are written by the printer's apprentice himself, Benjamin Franklin.
He had to write under another name because his elder brother James didn't want Ben getting involved in the newspaper.
Young Benjamin assumes the role of a middle-aged widow with progressive ideas and strong opinions on every aspect of life.
Name a vice in which women exceed men. Drunkenness, swearing, and idleness. If you talk to us, you'll learn that a woman's work is never done. As for ignorance, that's completely the fault of men who prevent women from getting an education. Women are taught to read and write their names and nothing else. We have the God-given capacity for knowledge and understanding. What have we done to forfeit the privilege of being taught?
Franklin got the tone of these letters, the pitch of this woman's voice, just perfect. Now here's a 16-year-old boy putting himself in the voice, in the position of a middle-aged widow, and pulling it off. It's absolutely remarkable. And that's what convinced me that Franklin's a genius.
Silence Dogood's letters, 14 in all, appear in the Courant over a period of 6 months. James, and indeed all of Boston, is beginning to wonder who this Silence Dogood really is. 16-year-old Benjamin Franklin can hardly contain himself.
And when he does say, these papers that you've been praising so heavily, and which are, after all, very good, these papers are mine, that doesn't help relations with the brother, the master, who's also supposed to be governing him.
Benjamin was smarter than James, was better as a printer, even as an apprentice, than James was. James would beat him, as masters commonly beat their apprentices. Well, Ben didn't think this was right.
In his 17th year, Benjamin Franklin breaks his apprenticeship agreement. He steals himself from his brother.
Franklin is now a runaway. He has no idea what will happen next, but he is confident, intelligent, and he has a trade. His life in the next 2 years reads like a novel by Dickens: escapades, mishaps, embarrassments, and conquests. He travels to New York and then to Philadelphia, where he works for several months as a printer. In Philadelphia, a wealthy man, impressed with Franklin's abilities, offers him an opportunity to go to London, and the young printer jumps at the chance. In England, he will encounter a world that will transform his life.
He falls in love with London. Everybody knew everybody in Boston. The big city, you lose yourself, free from any kind of parental or master control, and it's a pretty freewheeling time for him.
He sowed wild oats with wild abandon. He met women of all kinds. As he said later, he was always very lucky. He didn't catch any dreadful disease.
He is awake and alert, already quite knowing about the variety of human characters. He's 18 when he comes to London, and willy-nilly, in important respects, naive. But he is a quick learner.
Franklin survives in London by working as a pressman and typesetter in one of the city's many print shops. In this publishing world, he meets the notorious Bernard Mandeville, author of Private Vices, Public Benefits. He's enchanted with Mandeville's idea that there is no moral difference between good and evil.
Franklin evolves philosophies which will let him get away with anything. That God couldn't possibly object to evil, God couldn't possibly object to pleasure, because everything that comes to us from God, because God created everything.
He writes a little pamphlet, which he publishes, without his name on it in 1725. He's freed himself from one of the most serious constraints operating in the Boston of his day, and that is, he defines his religion radically differently than that of his family's religion.
Franklin feels at home in London's flourishing coffeehouse culture, where new and radical ideas are hotly debated. England is in the full throes of a revolution of human thought, a revolution called the Enlightenment.
The Enlightenment was a new way of looking at the world that suggested that rational thought and planning could lead to change.
It's a reduction of the importance of religion in life, and a much greater emphasis on the here and now and on the improvement of people's lives.
This revolution in human thought allows people to examine all aspects of existence, including the accepted belief that one's station in life is fixed and unchanging.
The basic assumption of the Enlightenment is that we're not born to be what we are, which was the traditional view for centuries, for eons. And once you have that insight, which is a modern insight, you can begin to change things. Education becomes important. You can change what you were born, presumably born to be. You can become something else.
These new and revolutionary ideas, Benjamin Franklin has taken it all in. Now 20, he sets sail back to Philadelphia. He will spend the long journey home working out the lessons, good and bad, learned during his stay in England.
This was going to be a new chapter in Benjamin's life. He felt a certain nostalgia for London, which had pleased him so much, and perhaps a little apprehension of the future.
September 23rd, 1726. 2 months at sea. For all we know, like Noah and his company in the ark, we may be the only surviving remnant of the human race. Philosophers write a lot of fine words on the pleasures of solitude. But man is a sociable animal, and one of the greatest punishments is to be excluded from society.
He's beginning to have second thoughts about whether one can live alone, whether one can be an island sufficient unto oneself. He's been really irresponsible. He's been really having a great time in London. Never put anything aside. The only reason he's able to come back is that some Philadelphia merchant is paying his way. It's beginning to dawn on him that this isn't quite the way to live.
Franklin becomes fiercely determined to change the direction of his life.
Those who teach the art of writing tell us that we must always begin with a plan, an outline of the whole piece. Otherwise, the essay will turn out incoherent. I've never had a regular design in my life, so up to now it's been a confused variety of different scenes. I must make resolutions, some plan of action. From this moment on, I intend to live my life as a rational creature.
He had a great need to put his life in order at that moment. One could almost say he wanted to become a good boy, a good, serious, steady boy.
1. I will be extremely frugal until I have paid all my debts.
As systematically as he has cultivated his mind as a teenager, he now wants to cultivate his emotions.
2. I will apply myself industriously to business. I will not divert my mind with any foolish schemes of growing suddenly rich. Industry and patience are the surest means to plenty.
Franklin arrives in Philadelphia in 1726. After the great metropolis of London, this town of 4,000 with dirt streets and wooden houses seems like a tiny country village. It is here he will start his life over again.
His story is, of course, spectacular. The youngest son of the youngest son for 5 generations back, as he says, in a world where primogeniture and patriarchy were valued, he sees himself as at the lowest rung of the ladder, and he's intent on moving up.
Benjamin Franklin was in a very difficult position if he thought he was going to rise as a tradesman within the patriarchal structures that existed.
In this world of family connections and patronage, Franklin is an outsider. He realizes that he can never succeed on his own.
When he comes back to Philadelphia, he really launches on a new resolve, which is this new morality that is going to overthrow the sense of unbridled self-interest, and which is going to suggest instead that people will do better working together, living together.
He recruits blacksmiths, shoemakers, shopkeepers, ambitious tradesmen like himself, and forms a club which he calls the Junto.
Franklin's formation of the Junto is the mother of all self-help associations. These are young men on the make. They need connections. Today we would call it networking.
Part secret society, part discussion group, part Rotary Club, the Junto meets in a tavern every Friday night.
Standing questions for the Junto. Do you know any rich people? Do you know how they got rich? Has anyone's business failed? Do you know why? Do you know of any fellow citizen who's done some worthy action deserving our praise? Someone who's committed an error for us to avoid? Do you have any projects the Junto can help you with?
They have debates, they have speaking exercises where they critique each other, not just for the ideas, but for the presentation, for the delivery, so that they're learning a certain polish. They're learning to talk like sophisticated businessmen.
Franklin is now able to borrow money, and 2 years after his return to Philadelphia, he opens up a print shop. Now an independent businessman, he soon realizes that it will take more than hard work to get ahead in the world. Franklin discovers that the very modern idea of image is crucial to his success.
In order to build my credit and character as a tradesman, I take care not only in reality to be industrious and frugal, but to appear so in public. When I buy paper, I make sure to be seen pushing it through the streets in a wheelbarrow. I'm soon considered an industrious and thriving young man, and merchants who import books or stationery choose me to sell them in my shop. Everything goes swimmingly.
The tennis player, Andre Agassi, said, "Image is everything." Franklin is always in control of how he looks to other people.
It would have been characteristic of Franklin at the time to make sure he hadn't oiled that wheelbarrow's wheel so that he squeaked through the streets and attracted attention.
My thoughts now turn to marriage. A single man is like half a scissors, an incomplete human being.
Of course, it was a great day for Ben Franklin, probably a great day for Philadelphia, because that's the day that he saw the woman that he would one day take to wife, Deborah Reed.
The story has become part of the Franklin myth. In 1723, when he first ran away from Boston to Philadelphia at the age of 17, Franklin was a young man fresh off the boat, walking down Market Street with 2 loaves of bread stuffed under his arms and one being stuffed into his mouth.
He actually sees a woman standing on the stoop, and she very much remembers seeing him because she thought it was very funny.
Now, 7 years later, he and Deborah agree to get married. Franklin has good reason to want to settle down. He has been having affairs with what he calls low women, and now finds himself the father of a baby boy. Deborah becomes mother to his son, William, and together they will have 2 children, a son who dies young and a daughter, Sally. Deborah proves to be an excellent helpmate. She runs the shop and is a shrewd businesswoman. Franklin's success in Philadelphia is due in part to his practical selection of a very practical wife.
Of their Chloes and Phyllis's poets may prate, I sing of my plain country Joan. Some faults have we all, and so has my Joan, but then they're exceedingly small. And now I'm grown used to them, so, like my own, I scarcely can see them at all.
Franklin now takes over a failing newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette. He becomes not only its printer, but its publisher, editor, and chief writer. From the first issue, Franklin transforms the Gazette, livening it up with local news and a touch of sensationalism. He puts his stories in the voices of fictitious reporters.
A butcher had a dream that he was killing a calf. When he woke up, he discovered to his horror that he was actually slicing his child in 2.
And he would often make up stories. He would relate gossip. He would sometimes relate as true gossip things that he had simply made up.
In Bucks County, we hear that a flash of lightning came so near a lad as to melt the pewter buttons off his breeches. Lad considers himself lucky that nothing else in that sight was made of pewter.
He recognized in a way that Rupert Murdoch today might appreciate that selling news was also selling entertainment.
The Pennsylvania Gazette also prints serious articles on a variety of subjects. Franklin, who had grown up in the oppressive uniformity of Boston, passionately believes that a free press will encourage ordinary people to begin thinking for themselves.
And certainly the Pennsylvania Gazette is a profitable paper because it exposes all sides of an issue. And sometimes it would be Franklin himself writing a letter under one pen name on one side of the issue, and then the next week writing another letter under another pen name on another side of the issue. And it was good for business, but I think it was also, Franklin thought, good for getting the truth out.
Franklin also begins printing a yearly almanac, the 18th century equivalent of a date book. In the day columns for which there are no entries, he squeezes in little aphorisms. Soon, people from all walks of life are repeating them.
He who lies down with dogs shall rise up with fleas.
Some are funny, some serious, all memorable.
The greatest monarch on the proudest throne is still obliged to sit on his own arse.
The way to be safe is never to feel secure.
Once again, he's encouraging people to examine the world around them.
Franklin is delivering something that's related to the sermon. Franklin is almost always trying to inculcate a lesson that will lead to improvement.
How many observe Christ's birthday? How few his teachings. It's much easier to keep the holidays than the commandments.
He loves to tweak. He loves to insinuate. He loves to grab you and surprise you.
Fish and house guests stink after 3 days.
Love your neighbor, but don't pull down your hedge.
Poor Richard is the ordinary man's philosopher, how to get along in the everyday world. He is the spokesman for sense that is genuinely common.
Creditors have better memories than debtors.
Franklin later collects Poor Richard's aphorisms on money and frugality and puts them in a book which he calls The Way to Wealth. Translated into many languages during his lifetime, the book has never been out of print.
If you want to know the value of money, go try and borrow some.
Franklin uses the profits from his successful publishing ventures to acquire real estate and set up partnerships with print shops all through the colonies. By the time he's 35, this once penniless printer's apprentice has become one of the wealthiest men in Philadelphia.
God helps them who help themselves. Everyone associates Franklin with getting rich. That for Franklin, getting rich is an end in itself. Nothing could be further from the truth.
To be really successful in a Franklinian sense, if you read what he writes very carefully, is not to be wealthy and to be conspicuously wealthy, to live in a big house, to eat off good china, to wear fancy clothes. That the sign of success was in your capacity to give back to the community. And that it was in serving that one achieved felicity. Where did the sense of obligation come from? I think there may well be Protestant and maybe even Puritan origins here.
Remembering the lessons of his youth, Franklin now turns his considerable energy to doing good, to improving life in Philadelphia. The country town of 4,000 has become a city, overflowing with 20,000 inhabitants. There are animals everywhere. Housewives turn their hogs out in the street to feed on garbage. Backyard outhouses overflow when it rains. The smell and the flies are terrible. As Philadelphia continues to grow, so do its problems.
I propose for the city I love an effective way of cleaning its streets. Some may think that this is a matter of small importance, that it is not worth considering the dust blown into the eyes of a single person in a single shop on a windy morning. But in a populous city, this happens all the time. Human happiness comes not from infrequent pieces of good fortune, but from these small improvements to daily life.
He's got, at some level, ideas that he's convinced are better than anybody else's. And he wants to see those ideas implemented. The trick is how to do that when you're not king. You're not an earl and you're not a duke, but you are a common citizen in the colony.
Franklin and the junto use their collective power to solve common problems. They form a volunteer fire department and convince tradesmen to pool their resources, setting up the library company, the first lending library in America.
Not the rugged individual, but a group of people sensing a social need can band together, not depending on the government, but taking the situation in hand and exerting whatever ingenuity and whatever strength they have to achieve what they think needs to be done. And I think Franklin did that on a scale that nobody in the world had ever dreamed before. the genius is social. And the voluntary association is Franklin's invention, and it's what builds America.
Working through these associations, he helps establish the Pennsylvania Hospital. He founds a college which is to become the University of Pennsylvania. He proposes America's first organization to exchange scientific knowledge, the American Philosophical Society. The voluntary associations also devote their energies to down-to-earth projects, like paving and lighting the streets of Philadelphia.
He wanted to make life here and now more comfortable for ordinary human beings. And that is new in the world. I mean, people had lived for thousands of years without really worrying about ordinary people. That's the Enlightenment for Franklin, I think.
The scriptures assure me that on the last day we shall not be examined on what we believed, but on what we did. Our entrance to heaven will not be because we kneeled and said, Lord, Lord, but because we did some good for our fellow creatures.
Franklin was a unique person. He was too smart in too many areas. He was modern in a world that wasn't yet totally modern, so that he really was set apart from other people. And I think it would be interesting to look at Franklin's character as a study in how a man finds himself, in essence, solitary, alone, different from other people, and finds ways to establish connections with them. They're not intimate connections, they're organizational connections, they're political connections. They're sort of a hail fellow, well-met connections. He certainly never found an intellectual soulmate among the men that he knew, and he settles for the kinds of relationships that he can find.
All through his life, Franklin never saw a problem that he didn't try to solve. Frustrated by inefficient fireplaces, he tinkers with a stove that gives off more heat using less fuel. He takes over the inefficient colonial postal system and speeds up the delivery of letters. And for the first time in its history, the post office makes a profit. He looks into the problem of defense on the frontiers and suggests a radical plan for an intercolonial union, illustrated by this cartoon. He tries to perfect tripless candles and invents a simplified clock that needs only 3 wheels. He wonders about the movement of storms and the social behavior of ants.
A lot of people who think carefully about one aspect of life or another, or one public service or another, devote serious attention to those problems or that particular chore, and then relax for a while, recharge their batteries. Franklin apparently didn't need to do that. He'd go from one public problem to a mathematical problem. Franklin's rest, for instance, if he were waiting outside the door to be admitted to an assembly room, would be to do a very complicated mathematical problem, or to think about an invention, how to perfect a man-made object. Franklin didn't really rest in the conventional sense between chores. His mind was simply too active.
At the age of 42, Franklin decides to make a radical change in his life. He will retire from the day-to-day operations of the print shop. To celebrate this event, the artist Robert Feek paints this elegant full-length portrait. Benjamin Franklin, printer, has transformed himself into Benjamin Franklin, gentleman of leisure. He will now have time to pursue the true passion of his life, science.
Science in the 18th century, natural philosophy as they called it, was made up of a number of amateurs, enlightened distinguished and extremely curious amateurs who had to make their own tools for the experiments. And Franklin was absolutely at ease in that world. That was the world in which he could thrive.
Franklin's curious mind now becomes intrigued by one of the great scientific mysteries of the 18th century, the phenomenon of electricity.
Never in my life has anything so totally engrossed me. While I was making experiments and then repeating them for my friends and acquaintances who come in crowds to see them, I don't have a moment for anything else.
In Franklin's day, electricity was much more of a puzzle than gravity had been a century earlier in Newton's time. Everybody was familiar with things falling and all, but electricity, it was just a matter of rubbing something and getting some sparks. Where did this come from? Very mysterious.
For Franklin, the pursuit of electricity started as a game. There was an itinerant Englishman who went from town to town showing gadgets that produced scintillas and sparks and could do things.
In one popular demonstration, a group of people hold hands and then receive a collective shock from an electrostatic generator. This game is performed by people around the world.
With the kind of mind and the curiosity he had, Franklin wanted to go beyond the amusement.
The great thing about every one of these parlor tricks, the simple phenomena of attraction, repulsion, was why, before Franklin, no one had any clue.
Franklin puzzles over electricity for almost 10 years. Why is a stream of water attracted to a charged glass rod? Can you kill an animal with an electric shock? At the time, everyone assumed that electricity was some mysterious force created by rubbing two different substances together. Through experimentation, Franklin proves that in fact, the friction does not create electricity, it simply moves a charge from one body to another. When these charged bodies are brought close together, the result is a spark. Electricity flowing through the air.
This theory was based on the concept of an electric fluid, like an electric current, and that this could exist in bodies in a surplus or a deficiency. He called one state plus or positive and the other minus or negative.
Before Franklin, people had no idea what electricity was or how it worked. After Franklin's fundamental insight, the phenomenon of electricity could be understood and harnessed as a force to change the world.
The way Franklin pursued science is totally modern, but we have to understand in his day, it was the exception. He would always emphasize that it was exploration. Nature had things out there waiting for you to find them out. You know that what you will understand tomorrow is greater than today, and you know that because the truth waits patiently for you.
Both give off light of the same color and have a crooked direction. Lightning and this discharge both give off a noise like a crack, and both are conducted by metals. The electricity generated in the laboratory is attracted to a pointed metal rod. Since they are similar in every other way, will lightning too be attracted to an iron rod? Let the experiment be made.
In the previous century, Newton drew a connection between the motion of the moon and a falling apple. In his century, a century later, Franklin drew the connection between sparks in his laboratory and lightning bolts in the sky.
Franklin hits on a method to prove experimentally that lightning and the sparks in his laboratory are exactly the same. They only differ in scale. The events of this fateful day are described by his close friend and fellow scientist, Joseph Priestley.
Secretly, because he was afraid of being made fun of, and with only his son as a witness, he raised a kite into an oncoming storm. Fixed upon it, there was a pointed wire, which was to draw the lightning from the clouds. They were in the storm for a considerable amount of time with nothing happening. Then, just as he was about to give up, he put his knuckle to the key and felt a definite electric spark. Can you imagine his excitement? The exquisite pleasure of that moment. He transferred the charge from the key to the electric jars. The jars could then be used to perform the same electrical experiments as if they had been charged by rubbing a glass in the laboratory. The sameness of the electrical matter with that of lightning had been proven.
Knowing this about electricity, Franklin asks himself one more question. How can this knowledge serve humanity?
It has pleased God in his goodness to mankind to finally show them a way of protecting their buildings from the mischief of thunder and lightning. Take a small iron rod with one end buried 3 feet.
In his almanac of 1753, Franklin reveals the details of his invention. A rod of iron placed on the roof of a building can safely discharge a bolt of lightning down a wire connected into the ground. He doesn't patent the lightning rod. It will be his gift to the world.
The ordinary lightning rod, the Franklin rod, is still the basis of the lightning protection code in every single country in the world. It's still today the best way to protect an ordinary house or a structure from lightning damage.
Calming the ogre of lightning, this frightening thing, this had a huge impact on the public imagination. There was an episode, for example, with 2 ships side by side. One had a lightning rod and one didn't. It was both struck by lightning, one destroyed completely. The one with the lightning rod, perfectly fine. First, the clergy felt that he was usurping a prerogative of the Almighty. Franklin said, well, we do not hesitate to protect ourselves from the hail of heaven with roofs and shields, so we should be entitled to do the same with lightning.
In an age of reason, his proof that the lightning discharge is an ordinary natural phenomenon and not a manifestation of the powers of darkness or the force of an angry God was seen as a tremendous blow for reason against superstition.
In 1753, Franklin is awarded the Copley Medal, the 18th century equivalent of the Nobel Prize for Science. This once runaway printer's apprentice is now the most famous American in the world. Benjamin Franklin is 47 years old, by 18th century standards, an old man. His contributions to science were remarkable, but if he could look into his future, he would be astounded. In truth, his life's work has just begun.
Learning is valuable, but on the day of judgment, we'll not be asked whether we have learned languages or philosophy, or even the proper name of every star. The sun and moon will have vanished, The constellations themselves will have disappeared along with all of nature. But our deeds, our good and bad works, shall remain forever, recorded in the archives of eternity.